Just 2 more days until the voting ends. Today, we're bringing you a comprehensive and final election 2024 preview. The presidential contest with a focus on Georgia and Florida. We'll look down the ballot, including the 6 constitutional amendments in Florida and the local contests you're watching. Chris Hand joins us on This Week in Jacksonville. And thanks so much for joining us inside our election headquarters. Chris Hand is a government law attorney, our monthly guest for the program. We call this Hand on Government. So let's start, Chris, with the race for the White House. I know polling says that this is a toss-up. Do you believe that?
Well, I mean, clearly, every piece of data we have, Kent, says that this is likely to be one of the closest presidential elections that we've ever seen in the modern history of the country. Every poll shows these candidates neck and neck. No candidate is leading in any of those 7 key swing states outside the margin of error. So, yes, I think this really is a coin flip election as we sit here right now, just a couple of days before the election begins. Right. I think the most important thing to remind people of at this point is polls are going to shift a little bit. There'll be developments. The only thing that each of us as citizens can control in this process is what we do. And of course, the most fundamental form of citizenship is voting. Just to give you a sense, Ken, as of sort of Friday morning, about 49% of Florida voters statewide had voted, 44% in Duval County, city of Jacksonville. That tells me that a lot of people who are registered to vote still have not yet cast their ballot. So I think it's important to note that from the outset. Each of us have a role to play. The most important role to play is as a voter. So early voting open this weekend in every Florida county. Also, polls open 7 to 7 on Election Day in neighborhood precincts. The election starts and ends with citizens, with voters, so I wanted to make sure we started today with that.
And this is something that you're always passionate about,
right.
People engaging in, I mean, it's not just a responsibility, but an opportunity to be involved in some of these decisions. One of the things I've noticed in this last week here is the activity of the candidates. So we're talking about the campaign for president. Vice President Harris was campaigning in Phoenix on Thursday, was also in Nevada. And as she kind of makes her final case here, these candidates are showing up all over the place. What's the big message from the vice president as she tries to earn those undecided voters to come over to her side?
Well, she made what she called her closing argument at the Ellipse in front of the White House in Washington on Tuesday, and it really had 2 components. Lots of political consultants will tell you every election is a choice. And so what we're seeing at this point is both candidates framing that choice. Vice President Harris leaning into strongly the idea of protecting democracy, highlighting statements that former President Trump has made that she believes could threaten our democratic system, that divide the country. She's trying to portray herself as a uniter, someone who will govern all people regardless of party, and also laying out some key economic and policy differences. That was one thing that was very striking about that speech at the Ellipse, Kent, because that is the place Donald Trump gave his speech that ultimately led to the events of January 6, 2021. I think people assumed she would speak exclusively about that. She did not. She talked about the importance of preserving democracy, but also used the opportunity to try and introduce herself even more and to talk about what some of her economic policies and her overall style as president would be. So very much leaning into that contrast on democracy, but also on policy issues.
Lots of activity on the Republican side as well. Let me show you some video from Donald Trump and his campaign. This was an event in Albuquerque late in the week, but again, in a single day in 3 different states, and certainly the vice presidential nominees, they're out there as well. Chris, this has been interesting. This last week, there's been a lot of trash talk, and I use that phrase because it's all about who's calling who garbage. Does that move the needle for people? Because it's certainly something that both sides have said, I'm offended. No, I'm offended. I'm offended more.
Ken, I think it's important to remember that at this point in the election, it's really about a very small slice of voters, those undecided voters. And most of the polls we're seeing, Vice President Kamala Harris has about 48% of the vote. Former President Donald Trump has around 48% of the vote. So that leaves about 4% of the electorate that's truly undecided. So the question is, both campaigns now very geared toward how do they influence those undecideds, try to move people to the polls. That's what a lot of this talk has been about. Of course, kicked off by the rally in Madison Square Garden, where a comedian who was appearing as part of that former President Trump celebration made those garbage remarks related to the island of Puerto Rico. There's been more back and forth this week on that. I think that all of this is geared toward how are those undecided voters going to be shaped. And, we know something about who those undecided voters are. Some of them are NPA or no party affiliation independent voters. Some tend to be younger voters as well. Some tend to be what are called lower propensity voters, voters who don't necessarily vote in every election. So both campaigns are very focused on two things: turning out their bases, making sure the people who say they're going to vote for them actually do that, but then trying to get into those undecideds and sway those one way or the other, because whoever's successful in doing that will be the next president of the United States.
So I think this is interesting. Florida and Georgia, kind of in opposite seats from just 2 election cycles ago. Florida used to be the swing state, and Georgia we knew was going red. Seems like that has flipped now.
It has definitely flipped, and Georgia is one of those 7 swing states. The other one in the southeastern United States is North Carolina, where the outcome is really on the razor's edge. It could truly go either way. Remember, in 2020, Joe Biden won Georgia by about 12,000 votes. So very close. It's had closely contested statewide elections since then as well for the U.S. Senate and other contests. So Georgia really is the new swing state. Florida has seen some changes in recent years. Look, we have a situation where Republican voter registration has grown substantially. They have among active voters, about 1 million voter advantage. Among inactive voters, it's a little smaller than that, if you include inactive voters. And we're seeing that in some of the turnout right now. As of Friday morning, there are about 13.8 million registered voters in the state of Florida. As of Friday morning, about half, 49% of those have voted. Of that half, that's about 3 million Republicans, 2.2 million Democrats, and 1.3 no-party affiliation voters, with the rest belonging to other parties. That tracks pretty closely, Kent, with the voter registration numbers in the state. We'll have to see how these final days of early voting and, of course, whatever remaining vote-by-mail ballots come in, and on Election Day voting itself, impact those final numbers. But right now, tracking relatively close to what the voter registration numbers are in Florida.
Yeah, we've got a lot more to talk to. That's kind of what we'll talk about in terms of the presidential race. But we'd invite you to join us tomorrow, 8 p.m. for our Vote 2024 special, The Road to the White House. We're going to break down the key things to watch in the presidential race. We've got a roundtable of political experts. Chris Hand is one of them. And then Tuesday, join us again. As polls close at 7 p.m., our special coverage begins, and it will continue throughout the night with live reports from around the state. We'll keep you updated as results come in from across the country. And we're breaking down the key races county by county, certainly in Florida and Georgia and the other swing states. You can watch all the coverage here on Channel 4. It's also available online at news4jax.com and News4Jax Plus. All right, beyond the top of the ticket, there are some important races and issues to consider. We're going to look down the ballot with Chris Hand. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
All right, this is our final Hand on Government episode here on This Week in Jacksonville before Tuesday's election, and record-setting numbers for early voting. Some interest on the ballot beyond the presidential campaigns, too. Yes, the presidential campaigns drives a lot of people there, but some of the other things that we're watching include 6 constitutional amendments in Florida.
Well, of course, we have a U.S. Senate race. Rick Scott's running for re-election. Debbie Mucarsel-Powell is opposing him. Be interesting to see that result. But as you say, some of the most impactful constitutional amendments that we've seen in a Florida ballot in a long time, Kent. As a reminder to our viewers, in Florida, you have to receive 60% of the vote plus 1, a supermajority, to pass a constitutional amendment. So we've seen a lot of political activity around, for example, Amendment 1, which would require school board elections to become partisan again 25 years after voters decided they didn't want them to be partisan, but most especially over Amendments 3 and Amendment 4. Amendment 3, which would legalize small amounts of recreational marijuana for recreational use, and Amendment 4, of course, which would restore a right to reproductive choice or abortion in the Florida Constitution. anyone who's been watching television in Florida, it's been interesting because we haven't seen a lot of ads about the presidential contest. People think that that's probably decided, but a ton of advertising, including some paid for by the state of Florida, in some of the constitutional amendments, particularly Amendment 4 and Amendment 3.
I'm getting them in my mailbox. I'm getting them on my
Everywhere.
phone. You probably are too.
Yeah.
When it comes to the two highest profile amendments, so Governor DeSantis a week ago was saying, and he is opposed to both of those 3 and 4 that you're talking about, but he said, hey, I just don't think it should be altering the Constitution. Maybe there's a different way to do this. Why has this become a amend the Constitution issue for those two topics?
Well, I think for a number of reasons. One, on the issue of reproductive choice, that is a question of fundamental rights. Florida has what amounts to our own Bill of Rights in the state constitution that denotes the rights of individual Floridians. That is traditionally, this is seen as a debate over a fundamental right, so that is why I think that's teed up for the Florida Constitution. I think other reasons we see amendments on the ballot sometimes are a couple of reasons, Kent. One, we don't have a statutory initiative in this state. So in other words, citizens can't create petitions to try and change the Florida statutes. The only power they have is the ability to change the Florida Constitution. So that's why we see a number of subjects that people might wonder, why is that in the Constitution? Well, if people don't feel like the legislature and state government is kind of responding to their concerns, the one outlet that citizens have right now is the ability to change the state constitution, in addition to elections themselves, obviously, deciding who's in state government. But if that is not achieving the desired result, citizens also have the right to change the state constitution. They don't right now have the right to petition for changes to the Florida statutes. They don't have a process like that to make statutory changes. So I think that's sometimes why we see a number of amendments.
You know, I'm curious about this. I said, hell, the presidential race is really what drives some turnout. Well, maybe in Florida that isn't as much the case because so much attention has been paid to Amendment 3 and Amendment 4. Do you think that that's a driver of turnout? And if that is, because those are pretty emotional things, especially on the abortion amendment, is that something that would tilt the presidential election in one side or the other?
I think this year, typically amendments are not drivers of turnout because they're so far down the ballot. I mean, this amendment this year, these will be, somewhere between sort of 4th and, 10th, depending on, which jurisdiction, what they're voting on this year. But I think they are drivers because of the massive amount of political activity around them. What you just referred to, those TV ads, those mail pieces, those text messages, that is primarily what Floridians are hearing messaging about this year, far more so than the presidential campaign. So as a result, I think that is going to move some voters to the polls. The question will be, does that influence their voting in the presidential contest or not? We really won't have a clear idea of that until after the voting has occurred and Election Day, November 5th, is behind us. But it'll be a good test case because, again, now that we're in a situation in Florida where those statewide results, at least for the moment, seem relatively predictable, it could be we're in a situation where these kind of down ballot contests have greater influence than they have in the past.
You mentioned the U.S. Senate race, certainly watching that one. There's also merit retention for Supreme Court justices, District Court of Appeal judges. There's a Duval County judge who's on the ballot also. That is one of the questions I often get at election time from friends. Hey, I know I've been watching the big race. What do I do with these? What was your advice to people so they can engage in voting there?
Well, first of all, just a little bit of context. In the mid-1970s, Florida changed the Constitution to have what's called merit retention for Florida Supreme Court justices and District Court of Appeal judges. Rather than having them directly elected, they're appointed by the governor, and then every 6 years they go before the voters, where voters say, yes, we want to keep them in office, or no, we do not. If they vote no, they don't want to keep that justice or judge in office, the governor then has to appoint somebody else. So what I would encourage people to do on those races is really take the time to inform yourself. There's some great sites, the news4jax.com site that has all sorts of election information, the election center there. There's good information about the justices and judges there. Also, your news partner at jacksonvilletoday.org has a series of voter guides, including some specifically on the justices and the judges. Take some time to educate yourself about them, who appointed them, what some of their rulings have been. I think there's a lot of good information out there for people to study. And also on the county judgeship. We are electing a new county judge here in Duval County. Those county judgeships are really the front door of the courthouse for most citizens. They handle a certain number of criminal misdemeanor cases. They handle civil disputes up to $50,000. So in a lot of cases, when people are having some dealing with the court system, they're dealing with the county court system. Using some of those same resources to learn more about the county court judge candidates so you can make an informed choice is really a good idea.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that you mentioned this. To catch up with which races are on your ballot, learn more about the candidates, we definitely want you to go to our voters guide, and you'll be able to find that on news4jax.com. We've got a full breakdown of each of the races there. All right, so what are some of the local contests that people will be deciding about? School board members, a sheriff, some mayors. Chris and I discussed that. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
Our Hand on Government episode continues with attorney Chris Hand, government law attorney. And you've also worked on the local government side as a chief of staff in the city of Jacksonville. Let's talk about some of these local races. Duval, Clay, St. Johns County, all with school board races on this ballot.
Well, and remember, that is a crucial part of local government. School boards and school systems obviously have a huge impact in how they educate our young people. Those are really important races. I think in many cases, arguably the most important local races on the ballot. As you say, each of those counties has at least one school board contest that has moved to a kind of November runoff, and you'll be sort of deciding the final composition of each of those school boards. Really important elections for people to educate themselves about, inform themselves on, and make sure to cast a ballot.
And this is potentially the last one where you won't have a partisan identifier next to the name of the school board candidates. In Clay County, they're electing a sheriff. Michelle Cook is the incumbent. A former sheriff, Darrell Daniels, also on the ballot, but this is an important issue there in Clay.
Well, it is. I mean, sheriffs are obviously very important constitutional officers. All 67 counties have a sheriff. Sheriff Cook has been in office previously. People in this community are probably familiar with her with her time with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Also was previously the chief of police in the city of Atlantic Beach, Florida. She's expected to win comfortably in that contest, but both candidates still running hard. Very important role in Clay County, like it is in any county.
So out at the beaches, Jacksonville Beach and Neptune Beach, they're electing a mayor. It's a little different than mayor of the city of Jacksonville.
Right. Those cities don't have strong mayor forms of government. And I'm not saying those particular candidates aren't strong figures, but the way the government structure is set up, they are members of their city council or city commission, depending on how they phrase that. So City of Jacksonville Beach, Christine Hoffman is the incumbent mayor. She's being challenged by Georgette Dumont in that race. Two candidates running in Neptune Beach. Mayor Elaine Brown is vacating office because of term limits there, so there'll be a new mayor in Neptune Beach. And those roles are important. It may not be the chief executive of the city. Both cities have city managers for that role, but still really important positions in setting the tone for the community, leading the community, helping to inspire a vision. Important races to pay attention to.
In St. Johns County, there are two measures that concern funding for the schools, two referendums that are on the ballot.
Well, Kent, St. Johns County, as you know, has long been one of the top-rated school districts in the state. And I think one of the reasons for that is voters in St. Johns County have sort of continually chosen to invest in their schools and try and make sure they remain some of the best in the state. There are going to be two propositions on the November ballot. One, to extend a sales tax that's currently in place to help fund St. Johns County schools. The other one, to increase millage or property taxes by a certain amount, also to help support the schools. St. John's voters have traditionally been supportive of these kinds of measures. We'll see if that consistent support continues on November the 5th.
So, Chris, before we run out of time, there was an announcement that the Florida-Georgia or Georgia-Florida game is going to be moving to Atlanta and Tampa for the 2026 and 27 seasons. Part of that due to the stadium renovation and rebuild. Mayor Donna Deegan had an announcement late this week, though, It's not leaving for good, that game.
Right. Yeah, so because of this happened the last time the stadium was kind of redone when the Jaguars first got here, but there are going to be 2 years where they can't play the game in the stadium because of construction. Rather than doing home and home on the college campuses, there's going to be one game in Tampa at the stadium there, one game in Atlanta at Mercedes-Benz Stadium there. Then the game will come back to Jacksonville starting in 2028. Looks like the city and the schools have signed a 4-year contract from 2028 to 2031. That's a typical period of time for these contracts to be signed. Of course, we'll find out then whether there are any further changes, but at least now, into the next decade, we know the Florida-Georgia game will continue to be played in Jacksonville, with the exception of those 2 years.
When you were chief of staff, we got about a minute left, but did you have to negotiate one of these, or did you see those agreements have to be worked out?
Well, that's something the city's always thinking about in these situations, and trying to maintain communications with the schools. That's just such a signature event here in Jacksonville, Kent. It's really something that defines the city, is a great tradition. So I think really important that new contract is in place. Obviously, this is the Florida-Georgia weekend right now, something that people look forward to every year, really puts Jacksonville on the national stage. So I think everyone agree, good news that it's going to stay here for the next several years.
Is that a bold bulldog red tie that you've got there?
Kent, you know where I stand on that, and if I'd been thinking more, I would have worn orange and blue today.
Okay. Chris Hand, I appreciate it. Hand on Government episodes are always fun. So where will things end up after election night? Will we know the winners by the next time we're together on the show? I don't know, but I hope you join us. I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching on air on Channel 4 and CW17. And you can always find us online, either on news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.